In the darkest days of humanity, when the air itself felt cursed, strange figures walked the empty streets. Cloaked in black, faces hidden behind curved beaks, they were feared, yet desperately needed. These were the plague doctors, silent watchers of death and fragile guardians of hope. Before science, before answers, there were only these shadows, moving through a world fighting to survive.
Close your eyes and picture it. The misty streets of Europe, emptied by death. A figure emerges. Black cloak dragging across the cobblestones, bird mask glinting under torchlight. The people watching didn't know if this was a healer or if death itself had walked into town. This isn't a movie scene. This is what history looked like. Imagine lying in bed, fever burning through your body, when the door opens and a tall figure shuffles in. Glassy round eyes stare at you from inside a hooked bird beak. A black waxed robe hangs stiff and shiny under the light. Gloves hide the hands and a wooden stick extends from the figure's grasp. Nothing about this stranger says comfort. Nothing says doctor. And yet this was the form of medicine sent to face the plague. The entire costume was deliberate. The cloak was coated in wax or oil so fluids would slide off instead of soaking through. The gloves and boots sealed the skin from exposure. That long stick wasn't a weapon, it created distance. Doctors used it to point at patients, flip over bedding, or even push someone back without making direct contact. But of course, the first thing anyone noticed was the mask. Its oversized nose curved forward like a hooked bird, and behind dark circles of glass, the doctor's real face was hidden. For people who had never seen such a thing, the look was uncanny. So why design something like this in the first place? To understand, you have to set aside what we know about germs today. At the time, medical theory focused on what was called miasma. The idea was simple. You got sick because you breathed in poison air, the kind that rose out of swamps, rotting bodies, or dirty streets. Since no one had seen bacteria through a microscope yet, this explanation actually made sense to people trying to connect the dots. If the air was what killed you, then surely filtering it was the way to survive. That's where the beak came in. The hollow nose wasn't empty. It was packed with strong-smelling items considered purifiers. Herbs like juniper, carnation, mint, and even dried roses were common, along with vinegar-soaked sponges to trap foul odors. Some stuffed in exotic spices like cloves or cinnamon if they had access. The idea was that when the doctor inhaled, the air passed first through the pungent mixture, stripping away the poisonous vapor before it reached the lungs. Of course, we know now plague spread mainly through fleas, rats, and close human contact, not floating bad air. The mask did nothing to block microscopic bacteria, but if you step back, you can see an early pattern forming. That stuffed beak was, in a crude way, the same principle behind today's respirators and gas masks, air filtered before inhalation. The waxed robe is like the first awkward version of a hazmat suit. Even the wooden staff feels like an early attempt at maintaining a safe perimeter. It terrified everyone around them, but it was medicine trying to learn protection. The irony is that this suit, built in fear of foul air, became iconic not for saving lives, but for how ominous it looked. And that leads to the real question. If the goal was protection, why did ordinary people come to see plague doctors, not as healers, but as living symbols of death itself? People often shut their doors the moment a plague doctor stepped onto their street. You'd expect people to welcome a doctor, but instead they bolted shutters and whispered warnings. Fear wasn't just about the mask, it came from the role these men played. They weren't hired like family physicians, who knew generations of patients and carried a sense of trust. City officials brought them in on contract. That meant when a plague doctor arrived, it was a sign the problem had grown too big to manage privately. Suddenly, you weren't seeing a neighbor's doctor. You were staring at a stranger paid to confront an unstoppable disaster. Their purpose added to the unease. At a time when so much of medicine was trial, error, and superstition, plague doctors often weren't expected to cure it all. Instead, they wrote down symptoms, marked who was infected, and in many cases delivered counts of the dead back to the authorities. Imagine the impression this gave families. A masked man entered your house, checked on the sick, scratched notes into a ledger, and left again without offering much real hope. To many people, it didn't look like treatment. It looked like documenting your final days. That impression only deepened with their grim duties outside the home. They were called to inspect corpses, to witness burials, and to confirm deaths when numbers needed to be recorded. Families who still clung to hope often saw them as the mark of doom. The black waxed robe and long silent mask stripped away any human expression. No visible eyes, no smile, no gentle reassurance. Just a faceless figure moving from one home to the next. The effect was closer to a shadow walking through the streets than a physician bringing comfort. In some cities, their presence sparked real unrest. For example, councils hired them during outbreaks, thinking it showed care for the population. Instead, neighbors spread rumors that just being close to these doctors carried contagion. Panic grew so intense that officials faced public anger. Communities that wanted protection ended up fearing the very person responsible for providing it. In more extreme cases, people actually demanded the doctor leave town, convinced his visits made matters worse. Faced with a dying population and chaos in the streets, city leaders sometimes gave in, sacrificing the only organized medical presence to restore the illusion of safety. What's clear is that plague doctors rarely symbolize medicine in the classic sense. They stood for a city's admission that the disease ruled the streets, that officials had no true solution, and that lives were being reduced to records. In many ways, the mask and robe weren't what frightened people most. It was what they represented, the surrender of control. Seeing one was like watching the city acknowledge that the plague, not the people, dictated the future. But strangely enough, this atmosphere of fear planted the seeds for a surprising transformation. The beginnings of protective gear in medicine. That beaked mask and stiff black robe may look like pure superstition, but here's the surprising part. It was actually an early attempt at the same kind of protective gear used in labs and hospitals today. To us, it looks eerie, almost theatrical, but in the 1600s, it represented one of the first efforts to create a barrier between doctor and patient. That's why instead of seeing it as just a frightening costume, you can think of it as the rough draft of the masks, coats, and gloves that medical workers now rely on. The suit stood out because it wasn't random. Everything about it was based on a theory, even if the theory wasn't correct. The long robe wasn't chosen just for appearance. It was heavy fabric brushed with wax or animal fat so that blood or other fluids wouldn't soak in. Layering added extra bulk, which they believed gave better insulation against what they thought was poisonous air. The herbs inside the beak were more than perfume. Spices, dried flowers, and vinegar-soaked cloths were all thought to trap and neutralize unhealthy vapors. To the people of that age, this looked like applying reason rather than leaving health entirely to prayer. It's important to remember how unusual that was. Many still believed in curses, sins, or astrological causes of illness. So a doctor stepping into the street encased head to toe, armed with a theory about bad air, was at least moving toward a cause and effect explanation. You could say it was flawed science, but still a step above blaming eclipses or divine wrath. And when you add small details, it starts to feel even closer to what we recognize today. The gloves protected the hands, the boots sealed off the legs. The wooden sticks stretched their personal space, giving perhaps the first documented version of keep your distance in medical practice. If you compare that image to modern photos of hazmat suits or filtered respirators, the shape lines up in surprising ways. Both rely on sealing the body from outside contact, on filtering the air before it's breathed in, and on avoiding physical touch. Imagine a split screen. On one side, a 17th century drawing of a plague doctor. On the other, a hospital worker stepping into full PPE. The materials are totally different, but without context, the resemblance is eerie. One is wax and herbs, the other is polymers and microfilters. Yet the core idea is the same: shield the body from an unseen threat. Of course, real protection against plague didn't exist until centuries later, when germ theory explained bacteria and antibiotics offered treatment. But the design left behind a distinctive silhouette, one that hinted at methods science would refine over time. So the figure that terrified Europe wasn't just a grim omen. It was, in its awkward way, the prototype of frontline protection. And that leaves one more question. What survives now? The nightmarish legend of the plague doctor, or the overlooked role he played as an early pioneer? The image of the plague doctor still sends a chill. The mask, the cloak, the silence, all designed with flawed logic, yet it carried the first outline of the protective gear that guards modern healthcare workers. What once looked like death walking through the streets was, in fact, a primitive attempt to shield human life. Fear and science often move together like that, each step forward born from panic. Share your thoughts below. Do you see the plague doctor more as a frightening omen or as an early pioneer of safety? Ghost or guardian? The figure remains both haunting and instructive.